The invitation came so casually that I almost missed how strange it was that it was a Thursday evening, the office mostly empty, the kind of quiet that settles after ambition clocks out. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above us, and the city outside the glass walls glowed like it was holding its breath. I was packing up my desk when Daniel Brooks leaned against the doorway of my cubicle, jacket already on, tie loosened just enough to suggest the day had taken something out of him. "You did great on the presentation," he said, his voice calm, professional, practiced. "I could use your input on a few things. Maybe somewhere quieter." I smiled, the automatic kind you give your boss, the kind that doesn't reveal anything real. Daniel had always been like that, effortlessly composed, respected by everyone, admired without trying. Late 30s, married, successful. The kind of man people trusted without asking why. "Sure," I said. "Tomorrow." He hesitated for half a second. "Actually, tonight, if you're free. My place isn't far." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Not fear, not excitement exactly. Something in between. A quiet alarm I had learned, over the years, to ignore that I told myself it was normal. Managers invited employees over all the time, right? Mentorship, career guidance, networking. That's what I told myself as I rode the elevator down with him. The silence between us stretching longer than it should have. The drive was quiet, broken only by the sound of turn signals and distant traffic. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. I kept mine on my hands, folded tightly in my lap. I was aware of everything in a way that made no sense. The rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of his cologne, the way the streetlights slid across his face and disappeared, that I reminded myself who I was. Ethan Miller, 26, openly gay, careful. I had spent years learning how to keep my boundaries clear, how to survive without complicating my life with impossible situations. And yet, there I was, sitting in my boss's car, heart beating faster than logic allowed. His house was larger than I expected. Modern, clean lines. Too perfect. It looked like a place designed to be admired, not lived in. No toys on the lawn. No photos in the windows. Just quiet. "Make yourself comfortable," Daniel said as he unlocked the door. Inside, the air felt still, like nothing had been disturbed for hours. Maybe days. I noticed what wasn't there before I noticed what was. No family pictures, no signs of warmth. Just neutral colors, polished surfaces, furniture placed with intention rather than affection. That we sat in the living room, a respectable distance between us. He poured drinks, offered one, and waited for my answer like it mattered more than it should have. Yes, we talked. The conversation drifted from work to life. He asked about my plans, my ambitions, where I saw myself in 5 years. Questions he'd never asked in the office. Questions that felt personal in a way that caught me off guard. "You ever feel like you're playing a role?" he asked suddenly, staring into his glass. The question hung in the air. "All the time," I said before I could stop myself. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd been expecting. There was something different about him in that moment. Less polished, less guarded. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was talking to my boss. I felt like I was talking to a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. I noticed then how quiet the house really was. No television, no background noise, just our voices and the space between them that I should have left. I knew that. Every instinct I trained myself to trust was whispering that I was standing too close to something dangerous. Not because of desire alone, but because of what it represented. Secrets. Lines that, once crossed, never truly uncross. Daniel stood up and walked toward the hallway, then stopped and looked back at me. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Something I don't usually share." My heart sank, not with dread, but with the weight of knowing that whatever came next would change things. Even if nothing happened, even if we stayed exactly where we were I followed him anyway as we walked down the hallway. I realized the truth I'd been avoiding since the elevator ride. This wasn't about work. It never had been. It was about loneliness, about silence, about two people standing on opposite sides of a line, both pretending they didn't see it. And as Daniel stopped in front of a closed door and reached for the handle, I understood something else too. Some invitations don't need words to tell you they're dangerous. You feel them in your chest long before they open. The door didn't open right away. Daniel's hand rested on the handle longer than it needed to, as if he were waiting for permission that neither of us was ready to give out loud. The hallway light cast a narrow shadow across his face, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. Not the confident executive from the office, just a man standing in his own house, hesitating. "This stays between us," he said quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Silence has a way of becoming a promise when no one interrupts it. The room was smaller than I expected, not hidden behind dramatic locks or secret mechanisms. Just a simple door that led to something clearly private. The air inside felt warmer, heavier, like it held stories that hadn't been told in years. Soft lighting, shelves along the walls, framed photographs turned face down, as if even they weren't allowed to look back at him. Daniel stepped aside to let me in. I moved slowly, aware of every sound my shoes made against the floor. The space felt lived in, but not in the way the rest of the house did. This room wasn't designed to impress anyone. It was designed to contain something. "These are things I never brought to the rest of my life," he said. That I picked up one of the frames, hesitating before turning it over. It was an old photo. Two young men sitting too close on a beach, sunburned and smiling in a way that felt unguarded. One of them was Daniel, younger, softer, his arm just barely brushing the other man's shoulder. "I didn't know," I said. "No one does," he replied. "Not fully." He talked then, not all at once, slowly, carefully, about growing up where expectations were loud and questions were dangerous, about doing what was required instead of what felt true, about choosing safety and waking up years later wondering when life had passed him by. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't step closer either. The room felt like a line drawn in the air, and I was terrified of crossing it. "I'm not unhappy," he said, as if rehearsed. "I have a family, stability, but there's a part of me that never learned how to breathe." His words hit harder than I expected. I recognized them too easily. That was the problem. There was no touching, no sudden movement, just the quiet weight of two people sharing something that wasn't meant to be shared. I became painfully aware of how alone he must have felt, carrying this room inside him for so long. "You didn't have to show me," I said. "I wanted to," he answered. "That's the difference." That difference scared me, because wanting has consequences. Wanting turns intentions into choices. And choices, once made, leave marks, time blurred after that. We talked until our drinks sat untouched and the house grew darker around us. He asked about my life, really asked. Not the version I edited for coworkers, the real one. The relationships I'd walked away from because they asked me to be smaller. The nights I'd spent convincing myself that loneliness was safer than risk, to some point. I realized how close we were standing. Not close enough to touch, close enough to notice. I stepped back without thinking. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. "This isn't fair to you," he said. The words surprised me. They sounded like responsibility, like awareness, like a door closing instead of opening. "I don't want to be a secret," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. His jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, as if admitting something to himself rather than to me. "I know." The room felt smaller after that. The truth has a way of doing that, shrinking spaces until there's nowhere left to hide. We left the room together, and when the door closed behind us, it didn't feel like secrecy anymore. It felt like gravity. Back in the living room, the distance between us returned. Chairs, tables, rules. The air was different now, charged with things we hadn't done and couldn't undo. "I should go," I said. Daniel didn't argue. He walked me to the door, his expression unreadable. Before I stepped outside, he spoke again. "I'm glad I told someone," he said, "even if it can't be more." I nodded, unsure whether there was relief or regret in my chest. The night air felt colder than before. As I walked to my car, I understood something I hadn't expected. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. Some secrets don't need action to change your life. Sometimes, just being trusted with the truth is enough to pull you into its consequences. I didn't sleep much after that night. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. My mind kept replaying the quiet moments, the pauses between words, the way the truth had sat between us like something fragile and dangerous. By morning, I realized the secret room hadn't stayed behind that closed door. It had followed me home. That AT work, everything looked the same. The same desks, the same meetings, the same polite conversations in hallways. But I wasn't the same, and neither was Daniel. He was more careful now. Professional to the point of distance. Emails instead of conversations. Meetings with other people present. Anyone watching would have thought nothing had changed. But I noticed the small things, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his voice tightened whenever our paths crossed. For a while, I thought that was the end of it, that we had stepped back in time before anything irreversible happened. Then the messages started. Short at first, neutral, work-related, but underneath them was something unspoken, something that didn't belong in written words. A shared awareness, a reminder that we had seen each other in a way that couldn't be unseen, that I hated how much that knowledge mattered to me. Point one evening, long after most of the office had cleared out, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of my computer screen. I looked tired, older than I should have. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just holding his secret. I was slowly becoming part of it. That was the line I couldn't cross that I asked him to talk. Not his house, not behind closed doors, just a walk, neutral ground, somewhere honesty didn't feel like a trap. We walked through a quiet park near the office, the city humming around us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking about that night," he said, "about what it meant." "So have I replied. That he stopped walking and faced me. For the first time since the secret room, he looked directly at me. Not as my boss, not as a man hiding behind titles, but as someone exposed. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, "but I don't know how to fix what I've been avoiding my whole life." I believed him, and that made this harder, not easier. "I can't be your escape," I said gently, "and I won't be your secret." The words felt heavy, but also right, like setting something down after carrying it too far. Daniel nodded slowly. There was pain in his expression, but also something else, understanding, maybe even relief. You deserve more than the space between choices, he said. That night, we didn't promise anything. We didn't romanticize what we shared. We let it be what it was, a moment of truth that forced us both to look at ourselves honestly. That I in the weeks that followed. Things changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but quietly in ways that mattered. Daniel started making decisions that belonged to his life, not his fear. I focused on rebuilding my sense of self outside of him, outside of the temptation to be needed at the cost of my own peace. Sometimes I think about that room, about how easy it would have been to step fully inside it and disappear. But I also think about the choice we made to walk away before secrecy turned into damage. Some stories don't end with a confession or a grand romance. Some end with restraint, with self-respect, with the understanding that love, real love, doesn't grow in shadows. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave the door closed. Time has a strange way of testing decisions you think you've already made. After that conversation in the park, I told myself it was over. Not just the possibility of anything between us, but the emotional pull too. I believed distance would drain meaning from the memories, that professionalism would restore balance. For a while, almost worked. Weeks passed. Projects shifted. I was assigned to a different team, a change that looked ordinary on paper but felt deliberate. Daniel kept his distance, just as he said he would. No late messages, no lingering looks. From the outside, the story had ended cleanly. But emotional lines don't disappear just because you stop crossing them. But I caught myself thinking about him during quiet moments, when the office lights dimmed, when conversations around me blurred into noise. Not in a romantic way, exactly. More like unfinished music, a melody that had stopped mid-note point one afternoon. We found ourselves in the same conference room by accident. A scheduling error. Just the two of us, seated across a long table, waiting for others who never showed. Neither of us spoke at first. I heard you might be leaving, he said eventually. Considering it, I replied. I think I need something new. He nodded. That makes sense. There was no tension in his voice, just honesty. And somehow, that hurt more than the uncertainty had. I'm glad you didn't let this become something it shouldn't have, he added quietly. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw what I hadn't fully accepted before, a man caught between responsibility and truth, trying not to let either destroy the other. I felt compassion, but also clarity. Me too, I said, and I meant it. That night, alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to grieve what never happened. Not the relationship, but the fantasy. The idea that connection, no matter how intense, is always meant to be pursued. It isn't. Sometimes it's meant to teach you where your limits are. I realized how close I had come to confusing understanding with obligation. How easily empathy can turn into self-erasure if you're not careful. Daniel had his journey to face. I had mine. The truth is, infidelity doesn't always start with physical betrayal. Sometimes it begins with emotional refuge, when someone becomes the place you run instead of the place you stand. I refuse to be that place, for him or for myself. When I eventually handed in my resignation, Daniel didn't try to stop me. He shook my hand, thanked me for my work, and wished me well. In his eyes, I saw something like gratitude, not for what we almost were, but for what we chose not to become. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stayed honest. I had protected my boundaries, even when it was uncomfortable. Some stories aren't about who you end up with. They're about who you refuse to lose yourself for. And as the doors closed behind me, I understood that choosing integrity doesn't always feel heroic in the moment, but echoes longer than regret ever could. I didn't think about Daniel for a long time after I left. Life has a way of filling the space you clear for it. A new job, new routines, different faces that didn't know my past or the quiet weight I'd carried out of that office. I told myself the story was finished, filed away like a chapter one didn't need to reread. But some experiences don't fade. They settle. Months later, on a random afternoon, I ran into him by chance at a cafe across town. No planning, no warning, just two familiar faces recognizing each other across a room full of strangers. He looked different. Not younger or older, just lighter. Like someone who had finally stopped holding his breath. We exchanged a polite smile, then a few words. The kind you use when you're not sure how much of the past belongs in the present. I hope you're doing well, he said. I am, I answered. And this time, it wasn't something I had to convince myself of. That we talked briefly about work, about the city, about nothing that mattered too much. Before we parted, he hesitated the same way he had in that hallway months ago. I made some changes, he said. Hard ones, necessary ones. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. His tone told me everything that mattered. That honesty had finally stopped being optional in his life. I'm glad, I said. And when I walked away, there was no ache, no sense of loss, just closure. That's when I understood what the story had really been about. Not temptation, not secrecy, not even love in the way people usually mean it. It was about choice, about recognizing when a connection asks you to abandon yourself, and having the courage to say no. Infidelity isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it disguises itself as understanding, as safety, as being the one person who truly listens. But if it requires someone else's silence to survive, it isn't love. It's avoidance. That I don't regret meeting Daniel. I don't regret that night or the truth we shared. I regret only how close I came to believing that my role was to carry someone else's unfinished life, that we all deserve more than hidden rooms and borrowed moments. We deserve relationships that stand in the open, that don't need shadows to exist. Looking back now, I'm grateful for the restraint, for the choice to walk away before desire turned into damage. That decision shaped me more than any romance ever could. Some stories end with togetherness. Others end with clarity. And sometimes clarity is the most honest ending of all.